Thank you for joining us. I'm Arlene Stein from Terroir Talk, and we're here today with Ivan Brehm from Nouri restaurant in Singapore. Ivan, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's 4 o'clock your time.
Yep. Thank you for the invite. I do this in a heartbeat again. I'm really happy to be talking to you.
Well, you know what? One day when all of this is said and done, we're going to actually find a way for me to get to Singapore and for you to get to Berlin.
Amen, sister. That would be awesome. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are going to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey as a chef, and a little bit about Nouri, the restaurant.
I'm a Brazilian native. I was born in a small town called Campinas in the countryside of São Paulo, the biggest state in Brazil. And I left home. I was pretty young, about 16 to 17 years old, and set out on this thing of being a chef. I always thought growing up that I was going to be a lawyer. My family is just filled with lawyers, academics, but something happened, and at some point in time, something clicked in my head. And at age 16 to 17, I decided to go cook. I was met with a bit of resistance, I guess, from my family initially. But they became incredibly supportive, and I think doors just started to open. It's funny when you're you're on track, things start to happen, and it became everybody's excitement, I guess, my professional choice as well. And so from there on, I've never really looked back. I left Brazil. I was 17 years old. I'm 35 now, and I really haven't been back since. I've lived in United States, in England, Spain, and Italy, and then here in Singapore. And it's been an awesome ride so far. About 8 years ago, I moved to Singapore. I was living in the UK then, and opened a restaurant with a couple of friends, and then decided to go solo maybe 2.5, 3 years ago and open Nouri. The restaurant has been thriving. It's a pretty small place and a very intimate kind of kitchen, and we cook food that we call endearingly crossroads. The idea behind the restaurant is to really use food as a topic for conversation about how community matters, how people are kind of connected to one another in more ways than one.
I want to ask you though, specifically, why Singapore? What made you choose the other side of the world?
I've always had this excitement about Asia. I was thinking of going back to Brazil after the UK. And in the interim, I got a job offer. A friend of a friend connected me to some people, and I came to visit and just fell in love with the city. Actually, I remember just being on the tarmac at the airport, just feeling really impressed with what was happening around me, and driving in a cab to the hotel. I was like, wow, this feels like a pretty impressive town to be based on. And I think what I appreciated the most, and still one of the things that I enjoy the most here, apart from this really intense multiculturalism, is the fact that the city helps you just work your ass off. It is a city that really encourages you to just throw yourself in the deep end and just go and figure it out. I love my job, and I'm happy and blessed to be working alongside people who are just as passionate as I am. And so the city helps. I remember being in the UK and running for the last night train, and having to dodge the burglar or the crazy drunkard. And I don't get to experience these things here. Sometimes it's a bit too manicured, but Singapore offered me the opportunity to kind of delve deep into this cultural exploration that became Nouri, and come out the other end, I guess.
If you can, give us a little bit of your insights into Singapore. I mean, I think it's a rather surprising place for most people because it's, on one hand, smack dab in the center of Southeast Asia, but on the other hand, it's sort of anti-Asian. And you talk about this intense multiculturalism. I think it's surprising for people to really understand the demographics and the embodiment of who is the Singaporean.
I think the country as a whole is still trying to figure that out. It's a very young nation state. And so quite a lot of that intense conversation has been happening in the last 30 years. What defines that? Food is at the epicenter of all of this, actually. It's the greatest identity marker, I think, is food and its food tradition. But it is a very diverse country. It has suffered the influence of a lot of communities historically, primarily now Chinese, Indian, Malay, and a large expat contingency, of which I am a part of. But the country has always kind of embraced, at least in my view of things, embraced hard work and always looked for some sort of spaces, cultural things. Try to avoid the rift between different religious groups, different ethnic groups. There are mosques alongside churches, alongside temples, and these are all deliberate, very orchestrated kind of decisions to try to get people to learn to cope with one another. Obviously, there are problems of several varieties there, but because of its size and its wealth, it's a country that's well run, I guess.
Would you say that generally people are very tolerant of each other, that there's a sort of a camaraderie amongst the citizenship that allows for sort of the acceptance of each other?
Some regards that is being lost. So the quicker answer to your question would be yes, but there's a generational kind of hump, I guess, that we've just went over. I guess the founders or the first Singaporeans to kind of edify the country's independence and indeed build the entire nation did so together, and it's really invigorating to actually be walking down the road and you stop at a bar and you see all these old timers, and there are Chinese, Indian, Malays all sitting around the table drinking beer or eating peanuts or just shooting the breeze, and you can tell that they've built something together. There is this sense of they've gone through a lot together. But I've sensed some tension in the last few years, when there was there's been a desire to unmute some of that tension. There is also a bit of fear of the foreign now, a lot of jobs, especially high-paying jobs, are given to executives, and so there has been, in the actual grassroots side of the community, there is the desire to actually, bring those back to the community. I wouldn't say it's all roses and peaches, but I think in the context of those little bits of tension, the country still does quite well to contain its problems and kind of negotiate a way through. Some people, and I understand why, criticize a lot this lack of freedom of press, freedom of speech. There is quite a lot in the foreign media conversations about this. The local Singaporean tries to occupy himself with work and to preoccupy himself with politics. And the country in turn seems to kind of provide as much as it can. This is an over romanticized version, I guess, of how my time here has been, but this is true to a large degree.
And you're no stranger to multiculturalism. You come from a country that is, in fact, most people don't realize, Brazil, how multicultural it is. I'm just going to read this out. You come with a mixed heritage of Italian, German, Russian, Spanish, Lebanese, Syrian, and Brazilian. I think we've chatted about this idea that there is no one from one place, and you embody that wholeheartedly. So tell us a little bit about your Brazilian experience and what you bring from Brazil to Singapore.
I think, like me, there are many Brazilians out there. I am a complete mutt, and it's become a very easy way for me to understand myself in a world full of mutts. I think people forgot, but at some point in time, we're all stemming from one particular branch, and I think it's easier for me to see that because I had to negotiate these differences. My conservative side of the family, it's all like mixed together, the Jewish side, the Muslim side. It's an incredible kind of mix, and learning to have to cope with that difference really taught me a bunch. I think tolerance more than anything. It taught me to not really be quick to judge the other because the other was also my family member, and I think I am able to see this here alive as well in this country. People that they have either through policy or sheer volition, they have to contend with the other person to embrace the different culture, and so I don't feel out of place here at all. And it's a pretty exciting place as well because you're consistently learning about something that you've never thought of before, another country, another culture, another person. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily bring something new to this place as much as I contribute to something that is already very ripe here. Local culture, especially the ancient part of local food tradition and history and tradition, is very much a hodgepodge of stuff. it's been influenced and influenced a lot of regional kind of neighbors and partners. So I feel very much connected to this kind of vibe.
Food is an expression of a language, an expression of a culture. What you do, Crossroads Cooking, is very much that articulation of your heritage, of what you're seeing in Singapore. Tell us about your philosophy in Crossroads and how that gets executed at Nouri.
The idea behind Crossroads is to study cultural manifestation with a lens, obviously, in food. I'm a chef, but that part's almost accidental. I think the mechanics of it are the bit that matters the most. The fact that culture is no accident. It's really a problem solving at its core, repeated over time. And somewhere down the line, and I believe that to be quite recent, we started to think that our culture defines our differences as essential. You know, I am from a different place, I eat differently to you, and hence we're very different people. But the moment you peel the first layer and you try to understand where your culture comes from, you start to realize that in more ways than one, we are super connected and we rely on each other to keep our cultures alive. Some of this reliance isn't necessarily positive. It's things that we have to contend with: war, colonization, slavery, problems that are like important to discuss under scrutiny with proper light. But if we do that unhinged, you know, if we're willing to go through the mincer and investigate our culture deeply, we come out the other end with a sense of universality that, for me, it's pretty special. And so Crossroads came about as a way to try to show this in food. Every dish we make in the restaurant is studied to try to elicit these links. You know, where is it that Korean food and Turkish food meet? There's such great animosity between specific segments of the population in the history of Ottoman Turkic, colonization of parts of Korea in the past. And at the same time, people forget that the things they enjoy the most about their food sometimes are deeply connected to that influence. And I use Korea as an example, but any food tradition has that. And so the restaurant is about that. Every dish on the menu shows that link, the link that exists between African slaves and Brazilian food tradition, and in turn, how that impacted Southeast Asian cuisine and curries in Thailand. You know, things that people would think are completely apart from one another actually have verifiable, tangible, palpable shared history. So the restaurant is about that. Crossroads is about that, but Crossroads kind of lend itself to also be a method for exploring just traditions in general and systems in general. And so we not only approach food in that context, but we also try to talk about how that can also be applied to every other cultural manifestation, you know, from music to art to architecture, in very interconnected systems that are reliant on multiplicity of input.
And just one other follow-up question to that, because we've discussed this before, and you know I'm a big fan of using food as a tool to actually help people come together and understand differences, because I think it becomes a matter of sympathy and empathy. And do you think
Yeah,
that food in explanation, when we look at all this intertwined relationships that we have over centuries, it can help be a tool of peacemaking?
absolutely. 100%. It was in my personal history. I saw it in action in my family and with my closest relatives and friends. And I believe that if applied politically, it can also have a deep, meaningful impact. It's actually beautiful to watch because people put a lot aside when the meal starts. You know, there is a little break there, and it doesn't matter how logical and how rational you think your particular positions about ethnicity or policy are. When you eat something that you connect with, that you enjoy, then you realize that the person who you disagree with has the same or similar connection to a very similar product. Then something clicks there. We see that in the restaurant all the time, uh, from an individual to individual basis. And I think in some regards, change happens at that layer as well. Like it really happens between communities just voluntarily taking part in exercises of sharing plates of food. Politicians can help or hinder the process, but I think it is a very grassroots kind of thing that happens. And in the restaurant, we see suits, and they sit down for a meeting they've never met before, and they break bread together. That's their first interaction, is to break bread, because we serve only one slice of bread that is partially cut, and so people have to pick at it together. And you see immediately there is a shift there in attitude. And so I think, yeah, long way of answering your question, but absolutely, food is an instrumental diplomatic tool. We need to learn how to use it.
Walk us through a little bit about the restaurant and the experience in the restaurant. So would you consider yourself fine dining?
I don't know.
Okay, walk us through the experience of the restaurant and how people actually interact with their meal, and before COVID, because we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of what's going on right now. But I'd like people to understand a little bit about the experience of Nouri.
When we designed the restaurant, we wanted the space to speak that language as well. And so, if we're talking about bringing people together through food and reminding them of their shared kind of history, we wanted that to be embodied in the space. And so the space is super open. The kitchen is the restaurant. It's not broken down by any barriers. The diner sits alongside tables. It's served primarily by chefs. It's very hard to distinguish a chef and a waiter. We don't wear uniforms in an attempt to kind of tone the separation as well between diner and producer or server of food. And so the restaurant experience is incredibly open and very inclusive. We are staffed primarily by women in the kitchen, most of our senior chefs as well, with the exception of me and Russell and Edwin, which are the three lonely guys there. And in the front of the house, it's the opposite. So we reversed quite a lot of the roles that most restaurants would have. We have the majority of male waiter staff. And we've noticed that kind of helped a lot. You know, the dynamic of the restaurant is very harmonious because of this very balanced equilibrium there between guys and girls. And guests seem to kind of enjoy this. They're forced to sit alongside people they had never met. They are served without ceremony. Obviously, we pay a great deal of attention to the important parts of protocol, you know, where to put your cutlery, what wines to advise with what food, all of these bits that make fine dining exciting and precise, but without the ceremony of wearing the gloves and telling the waiter that chef recommends you to eat food this way, so go tell that to your guests. So it's a very casual atmosphere. Guests generally say it reminds them of a house, and that's kind of what we wanted. So it really is that. There's a long ass table in the middle of the dining room where guests kind of popcorn their way around, and that table is also the path and a cooking station. Nouri, two years ago, we started a research center called Appetite. Initially, Appetite was a virtual space, but it's essentially how we kind of funnel all of the research that empowers some of the dish creation, but also what we realized, the opportunity for collaboration, essentially. And so Appetite became this kind of hub. Through Appetite, we started to discuss our work with universities, NYU, Yale, the British Library, and a lot of the impact of our work trickled down into the menu. But ultimately, it became its own kind of thing. If Nouri is like the gut brain, Appetite was the brain, I guess, is the best way to describe it. Recently, Appetite acquired a physical location, a place that is an interdisciplinary masterclass workshop space with 3,000 records and a long playroom, a private dining room, kitchen, and an art gallery. We will essentially curate art exhibitions 4 times a year. Every exhibition kind of draws on artists from all over the world. We have some pretty established Southeast Asian artists taking their paintings and work to Appetite starting next month. And so that space became the mix of the research center and a venue for people to come together and get kind of slapped in the face by ideas. Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about food systems. Singapore is an island, which most people don't know either. And it's the second largest maritime port in the world. But you are, as a country and a nation, highly dependent on import-export trade, including your own food systems. How vulnerable are you? And are you seeing any impacts of that as a result of all of these borders being shut down?
Mild, but it's orchestrated. It's very much an engineer shortage so that we have enough to last. The government's consistently ensuring people that there's plenty of food to go around, and it has a border with Malaysia, so it can still get quite a lot of its food supply through land. That's where we get our vegetables from on a daily basis. It is. I think money is key here, and I think the country is less exposed and less vulnerable than perhaps other countries that don't have access to this much capital. And because of how busy the port is, and the airport as well, I think it's the third or fourth largest airport in volume worldwide. Because of these things, it's in a pretty good strategic position. It has been a policy of the Singaporean government to develop its own food systems and food production methods. Lots of like super high tech vertically integrated farms and aquaponic systems, indoor, but this will amount to maybe 5% in the next 5 years. That's the expectation. There's a ton of money being pumped into this as well. But ultimately, it's hard to, it's hard to grow cattle. It's hard to, there's no chicken farms. Since the avian flu, they've kind of taken all chicken farms across the border to Malaysia. And so I wouldn't say it's a cozy position. The same with water, to be honest, not just food, but a fresh water supply is a difficult one. It has to recycle quite a lot of rainwater. And so it does well because of capital, I think. It pays what's necessary to get its ingredients here. I have experienced zero shortages that I couldn't circumnavigate.
Going forward, I guess the asset that you have, as you spoke about, is that Singapore is a very wealthy place, but you are still heavily reliant on travel, especially business travel. You're also a hub for
Sure.
Asia. What's the impact for you, do you think, look like long term out of this?
Before COVID, there were already signs of a looming recession just around the corner. And I think naysayers got smacked in the face pretty quick when COVID hit, because it's very apparent what's happening. I'd say there is still an internal demand to keep businesses that are healthy afloat, but businesses that were showing signs of difficulty before have already been scrapped. There's a lot of restaurants closing. It's going to be difficult. It looks like we're in for a pretty long haul. It's a disruption in tourism that it will absolutely impact the city's super manicured, and quite a lot of the biggest, brightest, bestest restaurants in town are in these really touristy areas. They're very beautiful places that have now been directly affected. The hotel industry has been plummeted. I have friends that one of our regulars actually lives in a hotel, and it's a 500-room hotel, and she's one of 3 guests that has been there for the last 2 months, and it's the same everywhere. It is going to hurt, I think, for the community as a whole. Whatever part of it you play, you're going to suffer. It won't be an easy recovery.
Tell us one last question. What's been the most inspirational thing that's come out of this for you, and what are you hopeful for?
This has been, to some degree, one of the most interesting things that has happened in my life. I think the moments we're traveling through, and I feel really upset about the life lost and the challenges that we are all facing collectively. But there's something very invigorating in the fact that we are facing them collectively at a time of really incredible divide. I think we are relearning what it means to be human again. I was always very uncomfortable about the idea that people thought they knew what tomorrow was going to bring. It's what we built the investment market on. It's how we made our financial plannings for the year. And it always felt a bit weird because I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And now everybody's having to contend with the fact that nobody has a freaking clue what tomorrow is going to be like. And when you're in that place, something happens. When you have to contend with the fact that you don't know, and all you can do is try to figure it out, that's super grounding. It's one of the most liberating things I've ever experienced, the feeling of having to figure it out, not assume anything, not take anything for granted, open your eyes every morning and go like, right, let's see what the fuck this is going to look like, and start there. Uh, so in that sense, this has been a pretty cool wake up, personally for me. You get in the rat race of running a restaurant on a day-to-day basis. It's very easy to forget, that you don't have control. That all you can do is your best, and the rest is kind of outside of your hands. And if everybody's collectively doing their best in the same direction, maybe we'll get out of this.
I think it's an important thing to actually remember, and good words of wisdom, Ivan, especially because this disease has no borders. And so it's been a
Zero.
very wonderful moment to be able to share experiences across the globe with people like yourself and get different perspectives. But I agree with you, everything's very regionalized. Ivan, thank you
Yeah.
so much for your time today. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. It's great to see you. It was a wonderful interview. And I hope we connect soon in real life.
Knock on wood. Can't
Yeah.
wait.
All right. Take care.
See you later. Bye bye.
Bye.